Ooh, we need the stream issue first. I jumped the gun just a little bit. There we go.
Oh. Don't forget to order your pizza with pineapple.
Sacrilegious.
What's going on? I ready to jump the gun just a little bit. I was a little too excited. This is going to be a very interesting conversation. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Dungeoneer's Pack Live. I am Josh. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'm seeing who's in the chat right now. I see Stephen Harris, Julie. Thank you guys for showing up. Underlevel. Thank you. Rivers. Thank you. And I got a bunch of Mac. What's going on? So Dungeoneer's Pack Live is a weekly live stream where I and a guest discuss topics for D&D 5th edition to provide insights or solutions to help you at your table. This week, I have a bunch of friends. One new face and two familiar faces. Thank you, Taryn, Eric, and Gavin. Thank you for showing up.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us, man.
Yeah,
Of course, it'd be great.
So, yeah, Matt Colville is obviously way more popular than us and pretty much a household name in D&D. But he released a video that struck a nerve with the folks in the community and had us in back channel discussions. For those that you don't know, a lot of D&D YouTubers actually do talk to each other. So we know
Scary, I know.
we know when you put us against each other and we see it and we kind of just laugh it off. So but yeah, we were discussing and a lot of us had some strong opinions on what was said, but also a lot of us had a lot of common ground. So in most online discourse period, we see that it's very easy to be divisive and just take a stance on something without actually seeing the other side. So we're going to talk about it. So Matt Colville's main point, right, was that online D&D discourse was flawed. That we're all coming at it at a different perspective and not necessarily seeing eye to eye. So my first question for you guys is, do you guys this is actually true? And where do you think that stems from?
I just wanted to add a preface here just to give Josh a little bit of cushion here. Just so everybody's aware, I'm just saying this to take some of this weight off of him. Don't consider what any of us say to be endorsed by Dungeoneer's Pack, everything. Our statements and opinions are our own, and Josh is just kind of he felt like this would be a cool live stream to have. So he's kind enough to host this discussion. So if we say something, that's us, so if you got an issue with that, hey, my Twitter handle, my Discord, feel free to talk about it. But yeah, I just wanted to give that little disclaimer before we got super into it.
I will say it though. I don't mind the hate. Go ahead and generate the clicks. It's fine. I'm gonna go for it. Yeah. Actually, before I even jump into that first question, I want to go around the table and I think it's very important to everybody kind of state what their perspective is, where they stand, and what kind of how they view D&D. Because I think that will be fruitful for the discussion.
So we don't get into too much back and forth. Do you want to just go in a loop, in a circle of people, in an order, or just jump in willy nilly?
You know what? I'll do a better job of it. I'll start off with one person and we'll just work around it after that. So we can start off with perspectives. I'll go on my screen. I have a certain order, so we'll go with start with Taryn, your perspective, work with Eric, and then Gavin.
Okay. So I like to define some terms here because I think that this gets muddied up in the internet discourse. D&D is a game. 5e is an engine. All right. So 5e is the game engine that fuels Dungeons and Dragons the game, or at least the 5th edition D&D game. So we're all playing D&D whenever we're doing this tabletop role playing thing. Within this kind of edition that we've agreed upon, the 5e is going to be our engine, right? You can tweak the engine to suit your preferences for play, but there's a point that comes where you are no longer playing D&D. You can say as much whenever you're playing Jenga, right? If you're playing Pathfinder, there's a different action economy there, right? There's a whole different system that comes with that. There are certain games that use the 5e engine that are not D&D. So I think it's fair to separate the two and say we can talk about D&D and what it's like to play this game. But and I'm guilty of this myself. I'm criticizing too much the 5e engine and I'm saying D&D, which it's that I think it's fair to say that that's been muddled up. So, but yeah, I mostly think about 5e as, like it says, the system, right? The 5e system is our game engine for playing this thing. So I think, in essence, D&D is a role-play driven scenario simulator. I'm using scenario here instead of combat simulator because there's plenty of times where D&D isn't used to simply simulate combat. There's a lot of combat light tables out there, actually. So, that's kind of the way I'm looking at it right now. You are role-playing out certain scenarios using the tools given to you in the 5e engine with rules that are also adapted for, D&D. So, yeah, I hope that wasn't too confusing.
No, that's perfectly understandable. So I would say your perspective really is looking at it. Obviously, you're known for not just being a YouTuber but designer, but looking at the guts of the game, mainly the engine, the 5th edition engine, and then also being able to separate that from the actual brand of that is D&D.
Yeah, I mean, D&D the game is something I look at that, like, yeah, sure, WotC designed the 5e engine. Okay, great. D&D is just like there's games that use the Unity engine. Okay, well, not every game that uses the Unity engine is anyone got a Unity engine game? I can, you know what I mean? Like,
not everyone's a bad jump scare horror game. Yeah,
yeah, right. Like, D&D is a certain flair. It's a high fantasy type of role playing game, and using the 5e engine, you can play a cyberpunk style. If you want to call it D&D, sure. But I think D&D is a shorthand that's often used to refer to the tabletop role-playing game where we throw D20s out there, like that. Yeah.
And then Eric, where's your viewpoint on D&D and how you look at it?
Yeah, so I guess I'd like to take a step back. In Matt's original video, I believe he overall says D&D, not 5e, right? So we're not specifically discussing 5e for this video topic, right? We're talking about D&D. I completely agree with him that we all approach the game differently. We all approach with our own biases. His whole point there is like how if you have a game of 2 players versus a game of 7 players, it's an entirely different experience. And I usually play with very casual, friendly people who are there, and like, yeah, we use those rules, and I make my own rules too. But at the end of the day, we're there to have fun with each other. I get that Adventurers League is out there. That's how I started with Adventurers League. I don't know that Adventurers League is the majority of players. I would be shocked to find that to be true. So I don't think planning around strict rules as written for our content, for our expectation of a typical game, I don't think that's reasonable or responsible. So yes, I agree with Matt at a high point here.
And then we just had a sub, and I can't even see what it is. So don't worry. I heard the little. You guys probably heard the alert also too, so don't worry about it. Turn that off. Okay, so yeah, I think the same point with. I agree with Matt Colville on the greater point was we're kind of coming. Everybody has their perspective and aren't necessarily talking the same language. We're not seeing the same thing, even to the same extent. I think on Taryn, your stream, you were, I believe, when you were trying to discuss what exactly is the midline in tanking. One of your streams, you were coming at it from one perspective, and then another fellow YouTuber, Pack Tactics, was coming at it from a completely 100% different perspective, and you guys weren't necessarily talking the same language. Talking the same game, just not the same language. So, and then and Gavin, where's your stance or your perspective on the game? Where do you approach it?
I'm sort of like in a mid ground between the two of these guys here, and or is it like this on the screen? The fact is that D&D is, I believe, when there's a lot of assumptions that are being made about it, when people actually bring it up as a topic of conversation, because people want to be able to understand exactly what the game they're playing and how it's being relevant towards themselves. I would say that saying that you play D&D is kind of like what Terrence said, it's like an engine. It would be like saying playing D&D is like saying you play a sport. like you have an assumption about like what the kind of person is, stuff like that. But you have no assumption about what specifically is actually happening in the game that they're playing. Whereas saying that you play 5th edition or Pathfinder or 4E, I'll just use those ones as examples, is like saying you play like soccer, basketball, football. Those actually give context to what the game is actually structured to be around and what you can actually expect is going to be happening in there. The weird thing about D&D is that you can say you play Dungeons and Dragons or 5th edition, but then at the same time, it's like saying you play D&D 5th edition, but there is no combat whatsoever. It's kind of like saying you play soccer, but every player is allowed to use their hands. And then at that point, there's a complete disconnect between anybody you could talk to online about it, because then nobody has any perspective or expectation that this is happening at your table.
Yeah.
And
to further your
happens,
analogy,
it's sort of like, yeah, it's the best thing I could write down in a few minutes. But it's the most clear way I could put it out to go, like when you're talking to people online, especially because everybody knows the perspective and anything that you say online gets mad misconstrued and misunderstood very easily if you're not using deliberate English, is the fact that when we say we play D&D, a lot of people just make immediate assumptions about everything that you're doing.
Yeah,
and you really can't do that.
Yeah, and I think it's a difference with your sports analogy. It's like, yes, we all play soccer, but some of us are, it's casual street soccer. Some people are playing professional level league soccer, and some are like somewhere in the middle, intermediate. And I agree.
That's even the subtext of that, where it still kind of aligns with everything. It's just this huge gray blurry area.
Yeah, so I agree. In terms of how I look at D&D, and I think you guys can see on the channel, I'm very much more casual. I'm not necessarily getting down to the nitty gritty of the mechanics so much anymore. Part of it is like after kind of ditching optimizing and just knowing the kind of game I like to engage with, I'm much more in the creative space of like looking at concepts and just, does it let me have fun and tell the story I want to do? Which is completely different from a lot of folks. Like I understand the mechanics, but I'll get some stuff wrong, and I'll admit it. I was completely wrong about the power level of the Tasha's clerics. I said they were okay, but I understand in the context of my table they're okay because my friends.
What do
are
you
ridiculous.
mean they're okay?
Yeah, but that's why. That's why. In the context of my table, they're okay, but in the greater, like in Terrance's game, they're not going to be okay. And in other people's tables, they're not going to be good because they just disrupt the balance. But at my table, where it's super casual, where those mechanics are going to interact in a way that it's not going to disrupt our game, but also since we're super casual, not much is going to disrupt my game. But the difference I think I have is like I'm aware of it, and then I make note in a lot of my videos, hey, talk with the DM, make sure this doesn't mess up your flow, to make sure this doesn't create a power balance. I don't see that enough in a lot of videos. I don't see that enough in online discourse, especially in earlier YouTubers, like the ones that are kind of grandfathered in, the first generation. They have a very distinct view of the game that's not shared by us newer YouTubers, other content creators now. It's very, very different. They even, for example, the DM dynamic of what their place in the group is vastly different how we think about it now versus first generation YouTubers, right? So,
I will say you mentioned the Tasha's clerics. Now, just for clarification, because I went so far as to say those clerics are actually unhealthy for the game.
Yeah.
And what I meant by that was completely at its core, these are clerics that are built at a completely different echelon of power compared to the other clerics in the game, which causes a removal of choice via, if you're not playing these, you're essentially playing a noticeably less viable cleric. Now, clerics are viable, absolutely, my favorite class, absolutely my favorite class. But the loadout that they get and the general power budget that was given to those clerics is much higher than other clerics that we've seen in the game. So I did go so far as to make the assertion that these two options, whenever they're in your game, are probably not good for your game. And I think even like Chris Hanalka said as much as like these clerics make the game less fun. It's Treant Monk for anybody in chat. So it meant one thing for me to make that assertion, and I know that like, hey, if I make a mistake, I'll totally do a redaction. But to see like even the optimizer community saying like the game is actually made a little bit less fun because of these guys, okay, like I think it's kind of fair at that point.
Yeah, and for me, like, and that's where I openly admitted like I was wrong, because actually seeing your guys' videos and talk about it, I was like, okay, I understand how it works with the engine. Like, I get a better understanding of like why this is disruptive for a lot of the games. But for me, my perspective, narrative, and fun, aka where however you can quantify that, I know at least again my table, it it wouldn't be as bad. But it's also because the version of D&D I'm playing isn't necessarily going to be hardbound to what is the rules, and and I think that's what core discussion kind of gets into. So, to the first question, um, again, do you feel what Matt said in the video was true, or is that discussion that devolves because folks deviate from the strict rules of fifth edition when they talk about it?
I say it's not inherently bad what he said about it. It did take me 3 times watching the video and taking notes to actually figure out what the heck he said, because it was not very clearly communicated until like basically the very last like 80% of his video, where I was like, oh, that's the point you're trying to make. But like you say, the games that people run in D&D are all very different from each other. Like one of my mods runs a game, which is super high fantasy, like Airship Skyworld, and their characters are so powerful because of all the homebrew nonsense that he's done that they're doing hundreds of damage per turn, and he has to scale everything in his game around that. So we're talking like we're going to like MMO levels of damage output and fights that he's having in there, which is really fun and exciting for him and his players, and he's not doing anything inherently wrong, but it's completely different from the expectations of 5th edition. Likewise, my fiance's playing at a game that's been going for like over half a year in 4th edition, and they've only had 2 combat encounters. Like it's almost entirely social dynamics and skill challenges at the very least, so much so that her DM the other day when they were running a session called for an investigation check, and she had to remind him that there is no investigation check in 4th edition. And I feel like the one universal thing that can be stemmed from all of the things that can be brought upon as discussion for D&D, regardless of rules-bound game system, is story sharing. Because any story that you have in D&D in a whole can be shared without any context to the rules or anything like that. It can be an experience that can be brought to anybody, and they can understand it, and they can reciprocate with it, they can enjoy it. But then when you start to look at it in terms of like actual hard rules and such like that, and especially when people come to bat, like those online personalities you see in comments of people come in going like rules this, rules that, or like they're like people that are swinging at a piano while blindfolded. It's just like they're trying to hit something with whatever they're saying, and that's kind of where the discourse for D&D kind of deviates into what we recognize it for as being just like this isn't helping anybody in any way, shape, or form.
Hey, Josh.
Yes.
Since we're all jumping around here, do you want to address Flute Salute? He's disappointed in us.
What?
In the chat.
Okay, where's the comment?
It's
okay.
Most recent.
Well, we just got into the first question. That's why there's a lot more questions.
Yeah.
Right. And also, there's a lot more questions. We just got started. Also, if you guys have any questions, drop them in the chat. We're looking at them. I actually have another question. Actually, I'll bring up the first one from Stephen Harris. Deciding on when a game passes the threshold of engine tweaks, making it different from a game, can be difficult though. Do variant or option rules count? How about small homebrew editions overhauls?
There's a sliding scale thing that happens with that, right? You can't really measure what's reasonable for a game whenever people are constantly saying, well, but my table does this instead of this. And it's like, okay, well, it's like whenever I'm designing a thing for the game with the expectations and rules that WotC put out. I'm assuming that that's the thing that we're usually talking about. So if the criticism is like, well, this isn't that bad, we can just change it. Okay, well, but like that, sure, that's still saying that this thing needs changes. Like, it's another criticism that I was trying to address in that video, where I'm like, if we're giving it that cushion of if we're giving it the cushion of something can't really be imbalanced or whatever because we can just change it around, it doesn't ever allow you to critique a thing. It doesn't ever to allow you to address the core of a thing that was put out, because by the time that you've changed it, it's no longer that thing. So like if I'm addressing a mechanic, I'm addressing it as written, right? So like my critiques for it are like as written. I might need a quick refresher on that. What was the last part of that question?
Let me pull it back up. Let's go. Okay, bringing it up also for the chat for you guys can see. The last part of the question: do variants or optional rules count? How about small homebrew editions overhauls?
Okay, Um, I rarely, like, whenever I'm designing, like, I'll think about some variant rules every once in a while. But like most often, I'm just thinking about the ones that they give you in like the Dungeon Master's Guide, right? About like flanking, right? I'm thinking about flanking. I'm usually thinking about things like variant ability scores for skill checks. Like someone might ask you for a Constitution Athletics check, and instead of adding strength, you add Constitution. So like I'm thinking about those like whenever I do design, but I'm not. I cannot predict what every table's variant rules are going to be. And, I brought this up as something that a critique I had gotten from my dancer, where someone was like, well, I think that your dancer's busted because of this homebrew thing that I gave my players that they abused. And I was like, okay, but I can't design it for your homebrew. So, like, there's a bias, right? Where they're like, I designed this thing, so it must not be problematic. And I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. I'm like, yeah. So there's an amount of that we can do to sort of estimate how good a thing might be at certain tables. That's why I think at tables with like variant flanking rules, pack tactics might not be all that strong. Rogue, I mean, just vis-a-vis, it's usually already kind of a thing. It's a little bit redundant at that point, right? Or like looking at Rogue. Rogue's power level shifts drastically at tables with flanking. So, just we do think about that and we can talk about that. But accounting for really niche stuff, like if they have advantage on a thing, light shines on their character. I don't know, something. I'm just trying to think of a random thing. I can't account for that. So, yeah. We can still talk about this game without having to factor in the infinite possibilities that can be achieved through homebrew. That's like my, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the criticisms on that you receive for the dancer with that one specific comment, I think that gets to the core of the issue, right? Like people are talking about D&D and 5th edition in a way that it's from their direct perspective and not necessarily talking from it either from a purely just engine based thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's how people are.
Yeah.
That's how humans operate.
Yeah.
I understand, and I know. So everybody has those rules.
Mhm.
I get that we can't predict everybody's rules. Obviously, we can't do that. But I don't feel operating off of 100% strict raw in ideal situations is always going to be super helpful. So when we talk about silvery barbs, I hear all the time silvery barbs. What if you already used your reaction for shield? What if you made an opportunity attack and now you're not using it? How do you factor that into this kind of a conversation? And I get that people like to talk about DPR and builds, and I get that people like to make content about that and that's wonderful. And please keep doing that. That's great. I don't find a lot of value in stuff like that because everything is so different. Just like we were talking about the clerics, right? Julie, we just played a whole campaign. I think we got to like level 13 or something. I don't know. And she was a peace domain cleric, and it was never a problem. Not once, because we're not trying to maximize every possible thing. And I feel like a lot of these kind of like hard rule type things assume perfect execution, which is just unrealistic, just like it's unrealistic to not factor in homebrew. Now you can't factor in homebrew because that's always going to be different. Even just the bonus action for the potion that like so many people do, that's homebrew. Not or banning classes, adding in classes, homebrew. You can't factor in how those are going to interact with each other. I don't know. I have clearly different feelings on this particular topic.
Sure. Maybe in terms of the like discussions that we're having about it, but I know whenever I'm designing a thing, I'm usually aiming for the system that I'm designing the thing for. So
Yeah,
if I'm making a variant rule, I'm making it for the 5e system. I'm adapting a homebrew class for the 5e system, and I'll design a thing with that in mind. I have to be able to have a non-moving target to aim at whenever I'm making a thing. And the moment that people say, well, with this variant rule, suddenly that target is moving at 90 miles an hour in both directions. And I'm like, okay, but I cannot reliably predict for every single variant rule that you might have at your table, you know? Now, whenever I'm talking about design, this is what I mean. Like, I have to have something to hit. I have to be able to aim at the 5e system that we have agreed upon. You know, like an action, an attack. What it means to take the attack action, I think means the same thing at 99.9% of tables. It means that you are using something on your person to intend to make an attack roll against a target. The attack action has a defined parameter. Now, there's other variables in the game that can change out what that means. Variant flanking rules could change what that actually means. That has impact on the attack action. You get extra attack, immediate change on the attack action. But I think at its fundamental metaphysical core, the attack action has a specific mechanic. And that's what I mean whenever I say, like, 5e as a system has these hard set defined fundamentals that at least I know whenever I'm doing design discussions, that's what I'm aiming for.
So, Taryn, I think our disconnect.
Yeah, different perspectives. Absolutely.
The video Matt was talking about is talking about content creation primarily, right? Like what we do here when we make these videos, when we talk about it. And this meeting here, this is about addressing that. And I think talking about design that you're doing, like, yeah, I think that's a great topic. I just think that's extraneous to this. Like, we're talking about not creating for it. We're talking about talking about it, right? So of course, if you're going to design, you're going to work off of that, because you literally no other way can you do that. But when we're talking about builds and balances, we can include like talking about fun, and we can talk about literally Matt's point in the whole video. The main first thing he talks about is the group size and how just that can be completely different. If you have a 2-person party versus a 7-person party, what's going to be powerful there is going to be totally different than the other one. If you're doing a role play heavy campaign versus a combat heavy campaign, what's going to be powerful there is completely different, and stuff like that we can factor in. That's what we can talk about.
I like to point out as well with Matt in his videos that he says that, like, oh, what would be really nice is if we had this very codified language for books and adventures that get released, saying that, like, oh, this is meant for this number of players of this kind of social or combat tactical dynamic in their games. So people that are designing adventures can actually offer these types of things to the different dynamics of the table. And I'm like, cool, man. It's not like they already don't do that. Because it's not like you have a bunch of social players that are going, oh, look at this, Dungeon of the Mad Mage looks like a really good time, versus the fact that tactical players are going, oh, I want to play Candlekeep Mysteries today. Like, literally, those are not designed for the same people. And it's very clearly that they're not designed for the same people. And as far as I'm aware, if you look at the back of the book, it still tells you how many people are supposed to be in each adventure. So it's like, I understand where he's going for with the fact that, like, if we had, like, you know, if we all lived on a forum still, we could have in our signature a code that delineates our levels of experience and where we focus in terms of actually playing our game. But I'm kind of going like, yes, Matt, but nobody lives on a forum anymore. And also the fact that, like, this system of actual gauging people's tables and games already kind of exists. It's just not printed in giant, easy to read diagrams on the back of the book.
So let me, I just want to make sure. So in terms of what we're actually addressing here, now, I mean, I'm coming with it with a perspective of the kind of content I create on my channel. If I need to remove that hat and come at it as just an observer, a fan of this game, talking about whether or not, like, we need to, whether or not these critiques of the way that D&D is discussed online is had, then, like, okay, I'll do that. But I mean, you know, I'm coming at this with the perspective of the kind of content I usually make on my channel, or like that I make for the game, where I'm like, I have a certain perspective of, I have a way of looking at the system. But if we're just talking about a meta discussion of the way that we talk about this game online, then, I mean, I can, hats off, right? Is that what we're going for?
For me, I think this highlights what the issue is online, period. The fact that each of us have a very, very distinct idea of what the game and how we're going to view and talk about it. For me, it's very apparent, Taryn, you have a very design-focused approach. Eric has a much more common table relaxed experienced approach, and then Gavin, you're still very much structured rules approach.
I'm very all round, but it's
So for me, it's like, okay, that's what's highlighting. I think for me, that's what I picked up off of Matt's video, and it's very.
I feel like when it comes to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's hard to talk about D&D without that perspective, right? So we're all coming at it a different approach. So obviously that natural clash, you guys are seeing it live. There's a natural clash of perspectives here, but we all love the game. We all love the same game. So where do we find our common ground? Like where can we find the common ground where we're finding the point where we can be productive about talking about online and having the online discourse of D&D, where people sort of just get it without necessarily resorting to pretty much the negativity that comes around it, because we've seen it. We've been on all of us have probably been on the receiving end of it.
Dodged a good amount of it.
Yeah.
I don't know how. I just have.
YouTube filters are a thing. So
yeah, I have.
Yeah.
I will admit, when it comes to, like, if you look at even like Critical Role, I mean, like the finale of season 1, which is only I'm like slightly aware of and stuff like that, Matt still got slagged for that because the rules weren't upheld even through the finale, and people were like, no, this has to happen the way it is by the rules. It's like, it's Critical Role, who cares? They're just there to tell a story. It's 90% of it at the very least. Have you like seen their players? Like, gosh dang, that would drive me nuts. But they'd be great players still. But I look at it for the fact that, like, even he's not immune to it. So, like, this is clearly a thing that just, like, encapsulates so much of the community as a whole, that when you look at, like, rules being implemented that you have no idea being able to gauge for, whether they're homebrew or variant rules and such like that, like, at my table, and I only do this because I run games on Foundry and I have a mod that tracks it automatically, I run variant encumbrance. And I brought people in on my games, and they were like, you run variant encumbrance? And I was like, yeah, is there a problem with that? And they're like, yeah, that ruins the game. And I'm like, what? There's, like, very clearly completely different expectations of, like, how games can be ran. And some people have completely knee-jerk reactions to some of the things that can be done with the game. I had a really similar reaction to a game that I played in. You can look at it in one of my story videos about when I had a night with tiefling twins. Yay. It was great. The DM that was running it for me, we were allowed to use cantrips with extra attack. And I went, really? And I was like, wait, with Warlock and Eldritch Blast, like, every time? And they said, yeah, every time. And I was like, wow, so the most responsible thing I did was I played a druid. So, to be fair, I mean, like, it's not even the point where it makes the game, like, different or not fun. I mean, you can clearly make the game not fun. You can make EXP individual per character. Holy heck. You want to ruin everybody's day? Do that. But when it comes to giving different rules and such like that completely change the context of the game, you could do it to the point where it's like variant rules, side rules, adjustments to things and such like that. That won't change the inherent value of what it is to play D&D, even in the edition that you're doing. But when you're changing the core basis of the engine, we know that D&D 5e, at the very least, at its core, is a combat-focused RPG. Like, almost every feature you get in your character, every magic item is almost entirely combat-focused. So if you're massively changing how combat works, that can change massively the expectation of what you're going to see when you're talking about it with other people. Like, heck, for a short while, I did side initiative where it was just the good guys versus the bad guys, and they all had their own initiative rolls at the same time. That completely changes combat when you do that. Did I fast track that back? Yeah, absolutely. And like I said before, cantrips with an extra attack. I've seen variant encumbrance on that one. There's flanking rules like Tyron put up and such like that. I don't use flanking rules anymore because I want you to earn your advantage, goddammit. And there's probably other things I can go off of there as well. I feel like if we want to talk about Matt specifically, like when I watch this video where he's talking about like the massive battles for kingdoms and warfare, whatever heck he's trying to pitch on that regard, and he's talking about all the delineations of all the different ranks and every single like position you have and how you move them around, I'm like, Matt, this isn't even D&D anymore. This is Gwent. I don't want to play Gwent. And I looked at it going like, this sounds fun, but this isn't D&D. And when you're doing stuff like that, I think that's where you can go like, okay, that's not D&D anymore. And that's pretty safe to say, because it's like, did it even come out of the books? Is it making a gameplay loop that isn't even reminiscent of what you were actually signing up in expectation of actually doing? That's when you probably have taken a step too far. But when it's sort of like, oh no, you don't use the Peace or Twilight Domain Cleric, or you use modifications of the core class of the monk or such like that. Because I remember reading your modifications of the monk, Taryn, and stuff like that, and I actually agreed with like 70, 80% of it. Like, all those are great changes. I would love to see some of those. But when you're doing stuff like that, it's like that's well within the realm of being able to do that. Though sometimes when people are talking about going like, "Hey, I'm playing in a party right now," and because I've had this real conversation like 6 times already, where somebody goes, "Hey, I'm playing in a party right now. We've been able at 14th level to kill a lich and its pet Tarask," and I'm like, "Wow, how on earth did you actually do that?" And like, well, the my DM gave me this homebrew staff to let me cast Meteor Swarm 11 times a day, and also we're like, after 10th level we were allowed to take 2 levels in any class that we wanted, so we were essentially 30th level characters or 28th level characters at that point.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay, well, now when you put that context into display, I can see that your game totally makes sense that that could happen, and I have no way of understanding that.
And they were still playing D&D.
Yeah.
And they were still playing D&D, yeah.
If I might, like, kind of, because you said something right there, Gavin, that I'm like, I kind of clung to, and I've been thinking about it, how to like, kind of formulate this idea. I think that no matter what we do, backseat gaming is always pretty obnoxious. Talking about the Critical Role thing, right? You got a lot of backseat gamers that are telling the guys in Critical Role how they screwed up that situation. Okay, sorry, I forgot I got to watch this now. Now, what I think is also bad, and what I really try to not do with my channel, and I think it's actually damaging, and is on us as content creators, is what I'm going to just call like front seat gaming. It's whenever we tell people how they should play this game. That, I think, is just as damaging to the scene as backseat gamers. I mean, I really try really hard not to frame a thing as like, this is how you should be playing this character. I'm even got like guides that I'm planning on doing for all the different classes that are more so just, here's the loadout that the class gives you and a play style that this enhances. And I'm trying to use language that it's like, well, of course you can do different things. You want to go backline barbarian and throw spears? Like, it's possible to do that, right? But I'm just saying that like the class expectation seems to be this, and this, So, I just kind of adding to your point, I can see this idea of like, there's a philosophy that we should have behind content creation. Whenever it's like, we don't need to dictate to other people, here's how you should play this game.
Even with my own guide videos, when I talk about it, it's like I'm very careful when I go, hey, let's read through this thing as it is presented in the book. And then when I give my recommendations, I'm very loose with it. Some people don't like it that I'm loose with it, but I'm loose with it because like some people are like, oh, with the Aberrant Mind Sorcerer, you should take Tasha's Mind Whip because you can cast it for free with all these different things. And I'm like, yeah, but here's the thing. Sorcerers already get Tasha's Mind Whip, so that's not unique to the class. And yes, that's a great thing, but that inherently changes a massive amount of your play style and commitment to your character as playing that kind of character. And I didn't recommend it because it's like, I don't want to literally backseat you in terms of like, this is how you should play, because that should be a choice you make on your own and understand how the mechanic works and choose the choices that you want to interact with that.
Right.
I really want to get into some of these other questions. Flute Loots had a question because when it came to optimization, this was like the big sting I think generated our conversation on this. So his question was, is it okay to talk about what is optimal in D&D in public forum and criticize the options, or is homebrewing or so rampant and accessible to new and experienced DMs that it's harmful and unhelpful?
If people come forward with rules clarifications, it's totally fine.
Yeah.
Because like that's the most easy way to clarify and talk about the rules is when somebody comes forward asking about the rules.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just really hard to know.
My answer when you're asking and talking about that, give context, and I think that's the big thing that is missing a lot of this conversation. Give context and also read into context. If somebody's asking, "Hey, how do I play or make Wolverine?" or in D&D, but like I want the flavor aspect of it, they're not asking for optimization. They're not. They're just like, what mechanics can I take that gives me the feeling of playing Wolverine? Now, if they're saying, how do I optimize Wolverine in D&D? That's where the optimization conversation comes in, and the same thing with design, and then in the critiquing realm. If you're looking at is fighter designed well and work well with the game in a design perspective, you're not going to come at it you shouldn't come at it with an optimization viewpoint and be like, well, if you optimize it this way, this, and that. It's like, well, that doesn't help or further the conversation. That's not actually answering the question. And I see a lot of this, and then for me, like, and that's where the bone pick I think people see when it comes to not just optimization people, but any people that talk about D&D. They bring in their perspective. Somebody's asking one question that is in this context, and the person says, "You're wrong because in my context, this is right."
I mean, my whole stance with the optimizer thing, like that is a way that some people get enjoyment out of looking at this game. They're having fun with D&D in a way that isn't playing at the table. Interesting. Like, cool. I mean, cool. If they like doing that, go for it. Optimizers and I think those hard crunchers actually serve a really good role in the design process. Like, if I need to figure out, like, okay, what's the most you can do with this thing? I could sit here and crunch it or whatever, but like, honestly, I'm trying to make mechanics of it work. And there are plenty of people. Actually, I'm really fortunate to have a Discord community where I have people that are crunching numbers for me like that. Like it's cool. I love that. And I felt like there was an odd I wouldn't even call it like really throwing shade, but it almost seemed like he took issue with optimizers in his video, or at least in like the first 2 minutes, or at least with a sentence he said in there that lumped in optimizers into, and I'm like, all right, as long as they aren't doing that front seat gaming that I was talking about, where they're like, you should never do XYZ thing because this is the optimal thing, then I'm like, okay, that's probably not great content to be throwing out there into the architecture of D&D. But I mean, if they're gonna make it, is it doing anything that's actually like throwing out hate or anything? Then I'm probably like, no, like whatever. It's not really hurting me. I can definitely tell whenever like, Treant Monk or Pack Tactics fans get into my comment section because they'll parrot what they say in a video and then not cite the source. So yeah, but like no, I love like Chris and Alka, Pack Tactics. What you guys do, it's no skin off my back. Like, you guys have fun with this game in a way that personally to me, it's like I don't just sit down and crunch out characters. I did whenever I first started this game because I thought it was fun to try and make, Geralt or whatever I wanted to make in the game. But me these days, I'd rather like, I'm more design focused. You guys know, you see my channel. Like I'm about like, what can we do to push the system even further? At least that's my thoughts. But yeah.
He lumps in like optimizers as basically like people who are like, I'm just going to say DPR enthusiasts, but he also refers to them even as like speedrunners in video games. In terms of like, you're trying to be able to min-max the math that goes into it. And the thing is like, here's the thing. D&D is not balanced for optimizers. It's literally balanced for like the lowest average point of a player power level the entire way through, because D&D is literally designed for the players to win every time almost. Because if they don't, the game sucks. Because the game stops, everybody dies, rocks fall, everyone dies, and everything's really anticlimactic, and nobody wants that. So it's kind of like the biggest issue that even I've had with some things for a little while, and I kind of gave up on this after a little while, was trying to challenge my players meaningfully with every combat encounter, especially because there was so much varying power levels, not even just in the way that the players play, which Matt makes a point about as well, where like one person joins your game and they're so good at it that you have to balance combat entirely around that one person being there. And then there's, people that are possibly playing like unoptimized characters. You were saying earlier, you pick the cleric as your favorite class, and it's got some very egregiously overpowered subclasses. I love the warlock, and if anybody picked the undying warlock, I'd be like, okay, I need to talk to you for a second.
Yeah.
And it's like, when you go for that, the game isn't even designed for it. So when you're going for like the most optimized build possible, it's like, yeah, it's going to upset the entire flow of the game. Not in any way I don't think is actually wrong, because like I said, I gave up on trying to challenge my players. I would go like, all right, let's set up mathematically what is going to work as like what should work on average. And if they completely overshoot it, then that's fine. The game's no worse for it. Yeah, the players might be like, I've heard very few times where people go like, oh yeah, the challenge that DM presented me with wasn't challenging enough. Oh, the game is so boring. Very rarely does that actually happen. Most players just go like, oh wow, I completely curb stomped Gavin again and his stupid spectral monk that tried to stunning strike me with like a attack that did 5d8 damage. And I'm like, wow, look at it, it's like a paladin and a monk in one hit. And they were super happy they were able to do that. Especially after I threw 5 more of them at once. It's great. But it's where I kind of go like, yeah, I don't really think when you go like putting all those guys together, like even like I said, speedrunning in video games is like it's a very different engine, and you could see it if you were watching speedruns of Elden Ring. It's like, oh hello, 75-hour game that's now being done in 18 minutes
Right.
because they found out what is massively overpowered and broken. Is that inherently wrong in the design? No, I'd say Hoarfrost Stomp is a fantastic ability to use in the game. It's just a shame you can cheese literally the entire game with that one ability. You can even go as far as to say like, oh, the Paladin is the most egregiously all-around strong character in 5e. It's like, yeah, if you value charisma, your little limited spellcasting, you divine smite the ever-living heck out of everybody that walks in front of your face. And that'll be completely different for one table. It won't be the same for another. Optimizers will have their field day with the Paladin. Meanwhile, I'm having people that are constantly trying to play the monk and actually figure out how it works.
Yeah.
So on terms of a table-by-table basis, it's going to change. In terms of like the way people play the game, it's going to change. And even the game itself is designed in such a way that doesn't really support most of any of that. If anything, it's got its bar set really low, just so that way victory is easily achieved.
By the way, I think Distortion brought it down to 17 minutes the other night. So
Really?
yeah.
What? Tell them to stop playing the game.
Eric, you got any thoughts on this question?
I've never played Elden Ring.
Oh no. No, the Flute Loot's question regarding let me pull it back up.
If people should be able to discuss it, yes, absolutely. People should be able to discuss whatever they want. You make whatever content you want, as long as we're not being harmful to others or something. Of course, like go for it. If I'm not like Pack Tactics, go make your crazy videos. Like go for it. I'm gonna be over here talking about fun stuff. That whatever works for us works for us.
Right.
I make stories about romances in D&D, and for some reason that does a lot for me. I have no idea why. I didn't even know people were interested in that stuff.
Yeah, I'm not making those ones.
Oh no, that's fine. I wouldn't recommend it anyway. It's a weird rope to walk.
All right, we got 10 minutes left, and there's two really good questions, and I'm kind of seeing it. I want to hit on them because these are kind of the discussions I'm seeing in chat keep popping up. So Gavin brought up a thing that I was already going to plan on asking. In order to help fruitful D&D discussion, would the game benefit from a hard codified language similar to something like Magic the Gathering or even 4th edition had, as opposed to what we have now, which is there's certain words that are codified and it's kind of just like casual language. Would having a hard codified, this is everything defined,
like how jump is defined in the PHP, but then we use jump
exactly
as a herringon term.
I already hate you for bringing this up.
Yeah, and exactly, because it becomes corner cases like that, right? It builds online discussion because we can't really figure out the rules based off what 5th edition is, and there's a lot of implications because of just natural language. But games like Magic the Gathering, where there's hard codified rules for haste, trample, mean specific things in the game, and if you give those two creatures, people that play that automatically know this is how it works, and that's it. There's no moving around it. But we use jump.
Yeah. So I'm going to take this one first.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the idea of the natural language design structure we have in 5e. I think it's relative, like it's easy to understand, at least at a high level, right? It gets you through there. What I would love to see is that plus like a whole, even if it's just a PDF available online or something, I don't know. But where it is broken out into hard examples, where it says if Herringon, for example, like it's written up how it is for the rabbit hop thing, but then if there was like an extra paragraph hidden, I know you don't want to fill the book up with this stuff, but of like how exactly what it looks like a walkthrough, so people have more contextual information to help you understand. Like, yes, I would love to see something like that, but specifically for that question, yeah, I do think hard code word type things would absolutely be helpful. That would move us away, and I think that would be a negative in the idea of the principle of 5e being just like somebody just like reading it. But I think that would be helpful for us as we're talking about stuff, and for a lot of people who are reading, because we're super involved in D&D, we're on top of it, we're reading those Jeremy tweets, we're looking at sage advice videos, we're on top, we're in that loop. But really, what? I don't know. I mean, 20%? I have no idea how many people that are playing D&D are super on top of all this stuff, that are literally just looking at the books. They get the book, they pick it up, and that's and they play their game, and that's it. So that information isn't funneling down. So something like that would be helpful. Ultimately, I would be in favor of it, yes.
I will admit, I did a community poll one time, and I think I got like some good responsive and stuff like that. And it literally said, "How did you learn to play D&D? Like you read it yourself, you were taught by somebody else, you absorbed the information roughly through like a video medium or streams or something like that." And the last option was, "I don't really know how to play D&D, but I play anyway." And that was 50+% of the vote, which that really concerned me. I will admit, it's sort of like I hope that people genuinely take to heart to actually learning the game that they are actually playing, because a lot of the time it's on the way the DM to just keep track of everything, because players, a lot of them, especially new ones, just sit down and just they don't care.
I'll make it short and sweet. Yes.
Yeah.
It just would. I mean, clear rules. Like, yes, please.
Yeah.
Clear.
Yeah, and I get
interpret.
you can't really interpret like I think you were to say right now. You can't really deviate from a rule if it's hard defined. I know why they don't do it. Obviously, 5th edition is successful for many reasons, and it's approachability. This is the game that I fell in love with and played and got me into tabletop RPGs. I've tried to play 4th edition, but the fact that I think Zevran brought it up, how hard codified 4th edition was. Just it didn't feel fun for me when I was playing it. And this is coming from somebody that played Magic the Gathering competitively, that I'm very ingrained in how keywords and the structure of that game worked. But coming in the D&D, it was for me, it was a 5th edition specifically, it was a breath of fresh air, because it was more, hey, we're going to play with your right side of the brain now and just let you create, let you do these other different things. And I get why. I think for fruitful discussion, I agree with you guys. Some sort of hard codified language where certain things are going to be defined, especially stuff like jump, or they work in a specific
Which
way.
Is defined.
Yeah,
and then we just ignore that it's defined.
Yeah. That's
now,
my
do
bigger.
I think we're going to get these rules, these official things? No, I absolutely do not think we're going to.
Right.
Get
That's Eric got to the core of it. My issue is that what we've been seeing sometimes in design is that there's already a rule that's set, and then something will come along that bucks that rule, and then we have questions about what happens with that rule. There was legitimately good discussion had about the interaction between silvery barbs and legendary resistance, and people that are like, well, it's clear. No, stop being pretentious. All right, it wasn't clear. There are people that I know and respect in the design scene that were like, yeah, no, this should be clarified. And it did. It took an errata. I say an errata. It took a special blip on their website, I guess, right? No, so yes, there are rules that aren't being taken into account. It would help to have some more codified language.
Jolie brought
I
up
don't
something.
even want to get my
I do too.
rant started about jump and the Haragon, things like that. Because, like I said, I can go on a huge rant if I needed to about the fact that Wizards of the Coast has been very apathetic about trying to support the instance of the game. You were talking about in your banning video you just put up, Taryn. Like the fact that they're all like, oh, it's just rules as intended, not as rules as written and such like that. And it's like, what about Adventures League? It's literally not a choice for them. And it's important that it gets maintained at a standard that is actually like, literally just the fact that you read it and it's like, okay, there's no deviation from that. That is exactly how it's supposed to work.
Right. And I realize that that's like, 5% of tables or something, but like they do exist.
I would never go anywhere near Adventures League, but I know a lot of people do.
I mean, I DM'd it for about 2 years, and I mean, so I've got sympathy for those guys and those DMs. I left after season 8, but yeah, I do. I understand like the frustrations that some of those people had whenever they were like, literally everyone is coming to this table with like Yuan Ti, Sorkadins or whatever, and it became like that was dominant, and I don't think that that's healthy for the D&D scene. So yeah.
All right,
I agreed.
Last question, because this is something that actually came up in our back channel discussions, and in regards to when is 5th edition or when is D&D not D&D anymore? Because when we're talking about it, obviously everybody's perspective is going to be a little bit different. So how we define D&D in our perspective is going to be different. Where people, I assume, don't think what other people are playing D&D are playing D&D anymore. So at what
point? To be clear, we're saying D&D, not 5e, right?
Yeah, we're going to say D&D because in context of Matt's video, because he didn't refer to 5th edition, he referred to D&D.
Mhm.
So there's a very specific viewpoint of what exactly is D&D for everybody. So yeah, so the question is, when does it stop being D&D? When you guys are playing, or when people are playing?
Whenever you say it's not,
Most do
you can
what?
do whatever you want with it. I'm obviously very liberal in this definition of D&D. I think D&D is like you can have it with the 5e rules. You can have it with the first edition rules. You can have it where you're just talking around a fireplace telling each other stories. That can be D&D. You can play D&D with Excel calculators to do your combat. As long as you're just in that general and then again, everybody's perspective is going to be different. This is my perspective. As long as you're a group of people telling, and that group can just be two, and then just having an experience together that's probably involving swords and dragons and stuff like that, and adventure and exploration and some sort of interaction, that's D&D to me.
Okay, so this is probably the one time I'll say something that could bring up like a bit of heat. So I think that there's a distinction between something like D&D and a game like Morkborg or Pathfinder. You know, we have these fantasy role-playing games, have a certain set of rules, yada yada yada. I will say the overall through line. Well, let me back up on that. A game, we can agree that D&D is a game, correct? Like we'll all come to that consensus.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I think that a game has to have a failure state. It has to have a point in which you are trying to avoid as a player, right? That could be, if you're talking about Catan, another player winning. You're trying to avoid, you're trying to get to 10 victory points quicker than the other players, right? Like there's a fail state of, I didn't do that thing before someone else. Pointing to this with D&D can mean a lot of things. But I think at its core, we can probably agree the failure state of the vanilla game is a total party kill. Probably?
I mean,
even
probably, yeah. Player death's hard to come back from.
But even then, there's always the asterisk of, well, they can roll up new characters and we can continue the story. Right, I gotcha. But if this is, again, that moving target kind of thing, let me hit like a real solid, steady target here. Let's just say it's a total party kill. I think that if there's a victory condition and a failure state for the game, the victory condition is just simply a continuation of the story. The heroes are successful in what they're trying to do. The failure state being, let's say, total party kill. Now, if we start to remove things like death, that makes it to where our failure state starts to erode, and we lose out on the power of things like Revivify, of like ancestral barbarian, zealot barbarians. There's no material components required to revive me. There are inerrant mechanics that are given to you to avoid this failure state of death. I think that if you remove that essence of death, I don't know that it's D&D. You're using the 5e system, but I don't know that you're playing a game that clearly has mechanics given to you to avoid this failure state. Now, that whenever I say that could get heated and hot, I totally get it. But I will say that the general budget of a lot of features in this game that you can take a Sharpie and just X out if you don't want them to be in your game, whatever. But I will say that the vanilla D&D experience seems to be that is the thing that you're trying to avoid. Whatever else you want to do with that is all whatever. But I also don't really know that this distinction of what is or is not D&D is really necessary. People are going to have those different experiences. I'm just talking about the vanilla game. So whatever your game is, whether it is or is not D&D, I think this is about important to the overall conversation as whether you are or are not a gamer. Like you're playing a TTRPG. Who cares if it's like D&D or Pathfinder? How much you've tweaked it, whatever. I just don't think that this feels a lot like that, like real gamer kind of talk at times in the D&D scene, and I don't know that it's really productive. Like I don't know what it's really helping or building up to.
I basically just gonna reiterate what I said earlier in the stream, kind of thing, and also it's kind of a parish of what these two have said as well. Is that in terms of like D&D not being D&D anymore, it really still needs to be at its core a game or it's collaborative storytelling, and we don't need rules for collaborative storytelling. We can just do that. That's campfire storytelling, basically. But when it comes to being a game, it's like you're using things like dice. You don't necessarily need to use minis, but you're still using the dice. That's a core functionality of the game. It's randomness baked into it. It helps enhance the storytelling. There's going to be an objective that you're trying to achieve. That could be virtually anything. It could be combat-oriented or not. It could be loot-oriented or not. But then when it comes down to the failure state, I think it's sort of like Terrence said. It's like it's death. Because that's the ultimate kill point for your characters to stop being able to go forward. And even then, it can't necessarily be death. It could even be the sake of like the fact that you have been imprisoned for life and there's no way or hope for you to be able to escape. That might, ultimately people might say like in D&D, oh, you could get away from that jail cell. But it's like in terms of it being a game, that could be what kills you. That could be the end state of your character. You failed in your objective. You could have a time limit. That could be all sorts of things that way. So the objective is a very wildly varying degree of on radar where the blip actually lands. I think having a failure state is important because most games are designed around that. There's a success and failure state. There's a challenge that you're trying to go over top of. And when you remove that core bit of what makes D&D an actual game, then it's like, I don't even think it's necessarily D&D anymore, let alone a game. I think that for the most part, it's very loose. And the good thing about D&D is that it can be very loose and therefore it can be very introductory to people, especially people who are not used to games. But personally, and it's something that I've been frustrated with the heck out of D&D lately, and why I haven't really made a lot of content besides other excuses that are totally reasonable, is the fact that D&D needs to have a solidified, this is how it functions as a game, and it needs to stop trying to be this roleplay engine that it's been built around because of the popularity of Critical Role, going like, okay, I understand that people love roleplay. Even I personally love roleplay, but I would love it if there were also rules that supported roleplay. Right. So that way we have actual people that actually know when you get into a situation, how you resolve it. It's sort of like, I love the absolute heck out of the Bloodborne board game, and there's one card in that game that I think exemplifies role-playing as a game mechanic that D&D never does, and it's, hey, you chase down this one woman through the streets, killing monsters on the way there, you found her, she's covered in beast blood, you don't know if she's infected or not. Do you kill her or do you spare her? That choice right there is great roleplay, and it's tied to a game mechanic. And we need more of that, I think, in terms of like actually keeping the roleplay that people love in D&D, but keeping it in the context of a game. Because the thing is like, oh, you let her go. You let her live or you kill her, you get different rewards. But that's besides the point. I found out later, in the second part of the campaign, if you let her live, she appears as a beast-ridden thing and has slain a bunch of innocent people in a chapel. That's, like, literally, that happens in D&D. And more often than not, that's where I want the roleplay to focus on, not the how well can you act your character. I cannot stress how hard it is. The fact that the more we lean into that, that's just musical theater, and it's not so much a game. We just need the rules to give context. Even Matt Mercer has said himself, the rules give context to D&D, and as long as we have those to bear it down, it remains D&D, it remains a game. And the more we just lean away from those things just to make a really fun story, that's where it just sort of, it stays D&D, but it stops becoming a game at least.
Two things real quick, I promise. One, I don't care what Matt Mercer says. And two,
I'm trying to be relevant to the topic, that's all.
Fail state does not mean death. I think we've already alluded to it, but I just want to reinforce your game, a fail state. Maybe that collaborative story you're telling, maybe somebody says something that happens and it wasn't the best thing that could happen. Maybe yes, at the end of the day, you all survived, you saved the kingdom from the dragon destroying it, but in the process, the royal family died or something like that. Like, you don't need to die for a fail state to occur. A fail state can be anything. A varying degrees of success can be perceived as a fail state. So I just keep that in mind, please.
Yeah, I was mostly just saying that because that's what the 5e, the Dungeons and Dragons character options seem to be designed around preventing, is the process of death with your character.
Catastrophic failure.
Yeah, like, that's why you get armor and, yada, yada, yada. That's why you deal damage, is because you're trying to cause the victory condition, right? Of like, either that or you have a roleplay feature that allows you to negotiate with this guy,
but we're discussing the outer bounds, right? That's the point of that question, is how far can you go with it? That not day-to-day stuff.
Yeah, but I think both you and Taryn and you, Eric, really hit the nail on the head. Taryn, you're pretty much at the end of your statement, you said, what does this question accomplish? right? It's sort of this gatekeepy, gamergatey question, and then Eric's response was pretty much within, as long as you're within the bounds of this fantasy game, really, you're playing some sort of level fantasy, whether it's Eberron, Ravnica, Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms, whatever, or your homebrew setting game, it's D&D. And I think that's the point a lot of people miss. The rules can define what necessarily is for that edition, but D&D is made up of multiple editions. But regardless, you're playing.
To point out as well, with even my point, it's more of a technical aspect I'm looking at it for. Because I mean, like gatekeeping, I'm super against that. I would never stop somebody from playing D&D. Because I didn't think it was good enough.
But that's the point. Whether it's first, second, third, fourth, fifth, or whatever the hell they come up with in 2024, you're still playing D&D. Is it different from Pathfinder? Yes. I don't think necessarily D&D is defined by one strict system, because we've had 5 systems, actually 4 or 6 systems if you count 3.5. It's sort of its own little thing. But Pathfinder is completely defined by the Pathfinder rules. The setting, the sole setting that it's in, is tied to its rules. And I think you see that a lot with other TTRPGs, that a lot of ones that are in the fantasy space tend to be defined. Their rules are defined that setting, what you're playing in. And D&D is an engine a lot of that ways. So there's not necessarily. I agree with Eric. I don't think there's necessarily one wrong way to really play the game. And the question, and then you bring up that same point, Taryn, saying what defines D&D for people is very gatekeeping. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I tend to wonder if that's the question, what it's trying to get at.
Yeah.
You know, I'm like, if you're asking a question and you're not sure, like, what kind of answer, I mean, what is D&D, right? Well, if you're asking a question, you're trying to get to the heart of a problem.
Yeah.
And I'm not sold on the idea that there's a problem. You know?
Yeah.
Like,
there's certainly no problem at individual tables.
Yeah.
They all know what they signed up for. And I think that that's the most important thing. It's just when it gets that beyond the table, it just becomes like weird, timey, wobbly, wibbly wobbly bull. It's definitely the fact that, like, at the end of the day, it's you and your table, and the fact that you guys are all having a good time together. No one's going to take that away from you, even if they really want to try.
Yeah. And yeah, so I'm looking at the time. We're running a little over. Any last thoughts?
Thanks for having me.
This is good spirited conversation.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, guys, the big point of this and what sparked up a lot of this conversation is because we needed to find common ground. Us being content creators on the receiving end of this, of a lot of this conversation, and seeing how, and a lot of the time, real time, how people's perspectives are commented and how they view our content, and how whether that impacts us negatively or positively, is one of the things where it's trying to solve the problem of how we have actual discussion about the game while also understanding people's perspectives. I think in a lot of this online space, this is just not exclusive to our realm. This is it's pervasive in every aspect of online talk. You see it on Twitter, Facebook, everywhere. People do not communicate. They talk, but they don't communicate. So in order to find common ground, whether it's in our space or in life, my only advice is find context, understand where the other side is coming from, and engage with it. If the other party is willing to engage with it and you guys are meeting at the same level, you guys are not, don't engage. You don't have to. You can skip, keep scrolling.
Swipe right.
Yeah, and everything's gonna be okay.
I think, like, I'm like, if the video and the content, whatever I made about banning, hopefully reinforces something, right? Like, I want people to think a little bit more about, like, why they leave comments, maybe, or like, have they really considered, like, is there really input that's necessary here? What am I adding to this conversation by saying X, Y, or Z thing? Because, like, if it is that, like, front or back or front seat gamery thing where I'm like, this is what you should be doing at your table, coming from either end, the creator or the commenter. I just think that generally that stuff is just not great to add to the architecture. Maybe unless like, like, yeah, that's, I don't know. I'm just hoping that like the entire YouTube space, like really, and it's creators of any level, just, I just don't get this mindset of like, you're not really playing D&D. It doesn't work for me. I don't understand that, but yeah.
It's not helpful to anyone.
Yeah. And Julie is pretty much bringing up, you can't fix the internet, but yeah, you can't fix the internet. So there's people, they're going to see this and they advise and be like, yeah, but I'm still going to rage on your comments. I'm still going to rage on your team.
And that's fine.
Yeah, and that's fine.
Thanks for the algorithm.
The banter.
Yeah. Thank you for the click-through rating and the little extra change that I'm making off the ads when you do that. But you can, if you're conscious and or self-aware of yourself, you can take a step back and just be a little bit more self-aware and be more engaging and polite with the things you're a fan of and the things that you're wanting to interact with. I don't think there's enough of that going around. That's at least not in the States. so
or choose intentional snark like I did, but
yeah.
Anyways,
so hopefully this really helped you guys out, in seeing our perspectives and seeing where we can actually kind of figure out where we stand, but also where we can find some common ground on discussing D&D. All right, Taryn, we'll start with you. Where can they find you and what do you have coming up?
Oh god. Well, I am Taryn Indestructible Pounds. I am a character option designer with a focus on 5e. I made the Merchant Dancer and Runekeeper classes over on the DM's Guild, and you can go find my channel over at youtube.com/indestructibleboy. You can also go find me on Linktree with Indestructible, and yeah, mostly my content is about 5e design, but I'm also apparently my best videos right now are on Elden Ring, so I don't know. Well, hey, that pugilist build video got like 12,000 views in a week, so I'm like, hey, I'm not gonna shy away from that too much. But yeah, I do whatever, live stream a lot, so yeah, come hang out.
Eric,
and also subscribe to all these guys.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. So support all of everybody here. But fryminis.com, check us out. We just launched our new subclass option for this month, which is a very cool. It's the Oath of Intrigue Paladin. It's kind of like a spy diplomat kind of thing. I think it's a fun take on it. Join us over at discord.gg/fryminis. Come hang out. And of course on YouTube at youtube.com/fryminis. Julie and I talk and we have fun and we talk about player experiences and we do DM review or stuff. We review stuff, minis, we paint sometimes. I don't know. We try to have fun. That's all. Thanks.
And Gavin, where can they find you and what do you got coming up?
You can find me over on the channel Death by D4, which revolves around everything Dungeons & Dragons, primarily creating guides for players and dungeon masters. But I also share a lot of personal stories and experiences of my games, most notably my tales as a half-elf warlock Davrian Luceren and his relationship with a young tiefling woman named Coco. You can subscribe to my channel. Feel free to join my Discord server as well. You can find all sorts of nice people in there along with myself because I talk to you like I'm nothing special in there. And I guess I have a bunch of homebrew subclasses that I literally released as a pack for every class in D&D 5th edition. If you want to come tell me how much my designs suck, I would absolutely appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right. And as always, guys, go support these channels. Sub if you can afford the Patreon. It keeps the lights on for everybody here. What I got going on for this week, let's see. I just released the Dark Detective Rogue build for you guys. You guys can check that out. You guys requested more Ravenloft builds, so Ravenloft inspired build. That one's for that. So, taking the lore out of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. That book had a lot of lore, and I actually like it for it. So
there is a lot of love for like Ravenloft content. It is crazy.
I was
I thought I was an outlier for liking the book as much as it. Van Richten's Guide was a great read.
Yeah, like there's a lot of lore that was like one of the sneaker books that I'm just like, oh, I'm glad I picked this up. Like this, it's really good. So definitely check that out. Also, what I got going on this week, I'm going to be streaming every day because I took the week off from work to celebrate my birthday.
Hey.
So
Hey, happy
yeah,
birthday.
thank you.
Yay.
So from 2:00, 2 p.m. PST, Monday through Friday, the streams will probably run from 1 to 3 hours. I'm going to be developing the Luchador class. I have a framework,
Mhm.
but my plan is to develop a Luchador, a martial grappler class. So definitely come in, check it out. I love some feedback, and yeah, so that's what I got going on. A dungeon sweeper. Don't tempt me. I will.
Dung sweeper.
Oh, dung sweeper.
Typo.
Oh.
Dung sweeper.
Don't tempt me. It will happen.
Right? Yeah.
But yeah, definitely. Again, thank you guys for coming on. Hopefully, you guys kind of learned something from this. Because it YouTube space can be very, very harsh when we're dealing with the public, and having the support of the guys and the guys and everybody else in our group, and having the support of you guys really helps fuel us and keep us going, really wanting to continue to do this thing. So having a more positive spin and finding common ground is always key to helping further discussions and further ideas expanding. And I think that's the big takeaway for me with Matt's video, despite whether we disagree on certain aspects or not. So again, until next time, guys, you guys have a good one, and you guys take care, and we'll see you next week.
Hasta
Later,
la vista,
everyone.
baby.
See ya.